Hi again guys, and welcome to yet another car breakdown, of course, from the 1.40 selection of vehicles, and this one out of the 5 was, as I've mentioned before, easily the one that I was most anticipating, the Toyota TRD Tundra. I'm a huge fan of these bigger, less conventional vehicles in Gran Turismo, and even just the oddball stuff in general, everything from the Jay Leno tank car, to the Chaparral 2J, to the Nike 1, to the Ginetta G4, those just weird, offshoot kind of vehicles that don't really have many rivals but are really good in their own way, or at least bring something unique to the table. This, in a similar way to the Raptor, is in a very narrow field of cars in GT Sport, because in the past of the franchise we had a number of SUVs, a number of trucks, whereas now you've only got 2 to work with. This and the Raptor. And that's 100% better than it was before this came along, because it was just the Raptor before. Now, the one cool thing that I will say is that even though we only have 2 trucks to work with, and I've been hearing a little bit of chatter of some people saying that technically these aren't trucks, not really sure what you're talking about there. Semantics aside, it's a truck, I mean, get over it. This is a very different approach to the Raptor. But, interestingly, they do share a lot of commonalities, not just the kind of vehicle and the kind of size, but even the price is exactly the same, and I tend to think that probably wasn't by accident. 55,000 credits for either of them means that they are, I mean, if it wasn't clear enough, most definitely rivals to each other. If this one was like 3 times the price, then maybe not, but even then. Now, the engine on this one is not as big as the Ford, and if you are curious about how the cars stack up, don't worry, later on this week I will actually be doing a rivals match, a showdown between the two, and I'm going to be comparing the specs in both their stock and tuned forms, putting them on the track to see how they actually compare. But what I noticed in my research and carrying out that episode was how similar the cars are, and funnily enough they actually trade blows very interestingly depending on if you leave them stock or if you tune them. Almost a complete reversal, in fact, between them. Now, in terms of what this one brings to the table, there are certain things that you could probably guess about it. Being a Toyota, for instance, the Tacoma set the precedent back in the day of being a much lighter option than many of the other trucks and SUVs. This one continues that because, I mean, it's not exactly like there are tons of trucks to choose from, but it's a lot lighter than the Ford is, around 1/4 of a ton or so. In fact, not quite 1/4 of a ton, less than 200 kilos, but close enough. It's a big difference. That's the idea. The engine is smaller, but it's still a 5.7 litre. You're looking at 379 horsepower, more torque than power, which isn't too surprising for a vehicle of its type, 401 pound-feet, and even though it is lighter, this is still technically a 2.6 metric ton truck. 2555 kilos. That's quite a lot. That's more, for instance, than a Bentley Continental GT, it's more than a Volkswagen Phaeton, it's a pretty beefy vehicle. You do, however, have all-wheel drive, which of course is not something that the Tacoma had. However, that could be a good thing, or it could be a detriment, because the Tacoma, I would say, was all the better without all-wheel drive. It made it that little bit lighter, and it made it a really good choice of drift vehicle. This one, though, could potentially be very different. Now, I'm also dropping a tune setup for this car in the next few days on the channel, and you'll see in that tune video just what this thing is capable of off-road, even without the max power. But when you do tune it up, what kind of specs are you looking at? What kind of range does the Tacoma have? Or I should say, the Tundra, not the Tacoma. Well, the range is actually very impressive. In terms of power, you're looking at almost 700 horses fully tuned, so comfortably N700 of course, and arguably more importantly than the power, you can drop the weight by a lot. As I said, 2,555 kilos to begin with, fully tuned you can drop it right down to about 1.7 tons. Around 800 kilos difference. That is a huge difference. That's like taking an entire classic car out of this car's original weight, or at least some classic cars like an old school Beetle, for instance. That's a big difference. It's like taking a Mini out of the rear loading deck of the truck and then driving it again. Now, in terms of performance, top-end speed is never the strength of a truck in any of the Gran Turismo games, and even the SUVs, they weren't necessarily the best for top-end performance, which is why some of them stood out so much, like the Range Stormer and the Audi Pikes Peak Quattro, because they were so fast, so much faster than the other ones. This one, you're looking at up around 180 or so miles per hour, and that's with the full 700 horses, so it's certainly not the quickest thing around. but again, it has the aerodynamic signature of a small building, so of course it's not going to be the quickest thing for top speed. However, thanks to the fact that you can drop the weight so much, and it has the all-wheel drive, a load of ground clearance, and also really responsive suspension off the line for launch, which is often a very good advantage that SUVs and trucks have, you can actually get this thing off the line pretty sharpish, even with heavily reduced power. Take this thing down around N300, N400, and you can still outpull a lot of sports cars off the line, which is not too surprising for a vehicle like this. That does tend to be one of the biggest advantages, that low-end grunt, and of course it's not just the all-wheel drive. The torque as well is very, very high, and when you tune it up, the torque really skyrockets. It's up around 700 pound-feet. Now, in terms of the handling, that of course is another area where a truck could very easily flip-flop between being really good or absolutely awful. And considering that the Raptor is the competition, this needs to be good, because the Ford Raptor is a deceptively good truck. You can keep up with quite a few cars in those kind of classes, as long as you keep it low. Of course, it's not going to take on supercars, but you can take on coupes, sports cars, even some sports saloons with it, and some classics for sure. This one can definitely do the same, and once again you'll see exactly how they stack up in that Rivals episode, but for now I'll say I really like the handling on the Tundra. And the curious thing to me, which once again you'll see in that Rivals match, is how this car is lighter than the Ford and feels lighter than the Ford, and yet the difference in lap time isn't really as good as you'd expect based on the feel of the car. The Ford Raptor feels every bit as big and as heavy as it is. This does not. And to highlight that difference for those who maybe don't drive trucks and SUVs that often, imagine the difference between driving a Nissan GTR and a McLaren P1. The weight on those cars is both quite high for what they are. The GTR is a very heavy super sports car, and the McLaren P1 is actually a surprisingly heavy hypercar, and yet the McLaren feels far lighter than it actually is, whereas the Nissan feels heavy. And it's fast, but it still feels every bit as big and as heavy as it is. This one is more like the McLaren side of things, whereas I would say the Raptor feels more like the GTR. Big, heavy, but still very good. This feels much lighter on its toes, and in fact I would say this car easily feels about 400 or 500 kilos lighter than it actually is. You could easily fool me into thinking this was a 1350, 1400 kilo truck, because again, if memory serves, that still wouldn't be as light as the Tacoma was in Gran Turismo 6, and that felt amazing as well. So as far as trucks go, I think it's a very cool choice to add to the game. The fact that we haven't had it before, just like the Raptor, definitely keeps my interest piqued. And yeah, I'm looking forward to using it more. I would encourage you to stick around, of course, on the channel over the next few days, and stay on the lookout for both the Rivals match between this and the Ford, and of course my rally tune for this Tundra, which is kind of a Paris-Dakar style. That's what I went for, with maximum fun. And it actually turned out to be very quick as well. I tuned it up to around N500, and it was as quick around Sardinia on the rally stage, or the rally course, as my Toyota 86 rally car, the Group B car. So a truck that can do that kind of lap time, it kind of speaks for itself. It's a very good choice of truck. If you've been using the Raptor extensively, give this one a try. I guarantee you'll like it. And yeah, I'm happy with it. I'm not the biggest fan of Toyota trucks in general, but this one is very, very good. So if you haven't tried it out, 55 grand isn't that much to spend, and who knows, you might end up liking it. But for now, that's it for this vid. Of course, stick around for the tune, as I said, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.